Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the internet's absolute favorite Cold War rumors. Have you ever heard the incredible story that a soft drink company somehow amassed a military arsenal so vast it rivaled the greatest nations on Earth? It sounds like something pulled straight out of a crazy spy novel, right? But believe it or not, it's rooted in some very real and, honestly, very weird geopolitical history. Let's get right into it. So, here's the provocative question that's been flooding internet forums and social media for literally years. Did Pepsi really become the world's sixth largest naval power in 1989? It's a staggering claim for sure. The idea that the makers of a sugary, carbonated beverage could suddenly possess enough firepower to command the open oceans, it's mind-boggling. But to separate the viral meme from the actual history, we need to take a hard look at the facts. Which brings us to our first section. The Great Naval Myth. You know, the internet absolutely loves a good corporate myth, and this one has taken on a life of its own, getting bigger and more exaggerated with every passing year. But what exactly was the hardware that supposedly made up this legendary corporate armada? Well, here's your magic number, 17. That is the exact number of diesel and electric submarines reportedly handed over to Pepsi by the Soviet Union. Just let that sink in for a second. 17 fully operational-sounding military submarines falling into the hands of a beverage CEO. Crazy, right? But that wasn't even the whole package. Alongside those 17 submarines, the rumor mill correctly states that the deal included a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer. When you look at this lineup, it's completely understandable why the internet ran with the narrative that Pepsi became a global military threat overnight. It literally reads like the inventory of a small nation's defense force. But how on earth did a soda company end up bartering for warships? Let's find out in Section 2, the origin. Soda for vodka. To understand how this whole thing happened, we gotta rewind a bit and look at the totally bizarre economic mechanics of the Cold War. You see, the Pepsi Navy story didn't actually start in 1989. Its roots go all the way back to the early 1970s during a time of highly restricted international trade. The crucial puzzle piece here is this economic concept called countertrade. Back then, the Soviet ruble was basically worthless internationally. It was an inconvertible currency, and the USSR severely lacked Western dollars. So, if you were a Western company wanting to do business in the Eastern Bloc, you couldn't just accept cash. No way. You had to engage in this sophisticated bartering system. You had to accept physical goods as payment, which you would then turn around and sell on the global market to finally get your money. And this led to a historic, truly groundbreaking deal in 1972. Pepsi actually managed to become the very first American consumer product manufactured and sold within the Soviet Union. Since the Soviets couldn't pay in cash, they agreed to a pure barter. Pepsi provided their famous soda syrup, and in direct exchange, the Soviet government paid them by granting Pepsi the exclusive U.S. import and distribution rights to the famous Stolichnaya vodka. It was an incredibly elegant, simple trade. Cola for vodka. All right, moving on to Section 3, the 1989 crisis. For a long time, that cola for vodka trade worked perfectly. But as the decades passed, the economic landscape started to shift dramatically beneath their feet. By the late 1980s, Pepsi's business in the USSR was absolutely massive. We're talking over 20 bottling plants operating across the Soviet Union. But there was a huge problem brewing. The American market was now completely saturated with Stolichnaya vodka. Americans just couldn't drink enough vodka to cover the rising costs of Soviet soda consumption. Plus, geopolitical tensions were hurting Russian imports in the U.S. anyway. So by 1989, it was time to renew this massive, multi-billion-dollar contract. Mikhail Gorbachev's government still had no hard currency, and they had a growing debt to Pepsi. So what did they do? They offered the only thing of value they had in excess: maritime military scrap. Let's unpack this in our final section, the scrap fleet. This right here is exactly where the legend meets the rust. The deal was struck, the ships were transferred, but the condition of these vessels is where the myth completely falls apart. We have to cleanly separate this viral meme from the rusty logistical truth. The internet myth insists that Pepsi overnight possessed a fleet capable of conquering small countries, ranking them 6th or 7th in the world. But the reality? Vastly different. Pepsi received unnavigable ghost ships purely for their scrap metal value. They were never meant to sail under a corporate flag, and they certainly weren't going to be used to enforce soda monopolies. The absolute truth is, these vessels were completely incapable of combat. Before the Soviet Union handed over a single ship, they totally stripped them. All classified systems, communication arrays, radars, and weaponry were entirely removed prior to delivery. What was left were completely obsolete, severely rusted metal husks. They were literally floating junk. Furthermore, Pepsi never even operated them. They never hired captains or crews or anything like that. In this transaction, Pepsi acted strictly as a financial intermediary, just finding a highly creative way to get paid. Far from patrolling the open oceans, the reality was purely logistical. The moment the ownership was transferred on paper, the destiny of these ships was already sealed. They were immediately routed to a ship recycling yard in Sweden and later Norway. There, these once feared Soviet vessels were simply dismantled and sold off as raw steel scrap on the commodities market. It was with the hard cash generated from that scrap steel that Pepsi finally paid themselves for the soda concentrate they had delivered to the USSR. When you think about it, it was really just another, slightly wilder, form of countertrade. The sheer absurdity of the whole deal is perfectly encapsulated in a hilarious quote from then PepsiCo CEO Donald Kendall. Joking to Brent Scowcroft, the U.S. National Security Advisor, Kendall quipped, "We're disarming the Soviet Union faster than you are." It was a brilliant PR moment for Pepsi. It playfully acknowledged the absolute weirdness of a soda company facilitating the destruction of Soviet military hardware, even if it was really just rusty scrap. So we leave you with this final thought to reflect on. How did a simple shortage of foreign currency drive the strangest corporate deal of the Cold War? It's a fascinating reminder of how economic necessity can birth an enduring piece of fake history. The Pepsi Navy was never a military superpower. It was just an incredibly inventive and very heavy way to pay a massive grocery bill. We really hope this explainer satisfied your curiosity and gave you the real facts behind the meme. Thanks for joining us. Keep questioning what you read online and keep learning.